I'm Henry Neufeld of Energion Publications, and I'm here to welcome you to an important conversation that will be held with some of our Energion authors. And today we have Reverend Steve Kindle, who is going to host the conversation. And the conversation will be with Reverend Janice Springer and Dr. Bruce Epperly. Reverend Springer has written a book, I Know We're All Welcome at the Table, but Do I Have to Sit Next to You? It deals with how we welcome one another and how we learn to work together in the church in a diverse society. Dr. Bruce Epperly has written many things on theology, biblical studies, but often especially with application to ministry, and he's going to join Janice in this discussion. So welcome Reverend Steve Kindle, Reverend Janice Springer, and Dr. Bruce Epperly.
Well, thank you for joining us for what will be a delightful interview with two very well-informed people who are going to help us navigate these trying times that we're living in. We know what Jesus wants from us, but we find it very difficult sometimes to actually follow through. And that's what our predicament is that we're going to talk about today. We have two books in mind for this, both from Energion, as you know. Janice Springer wrote, I know we're all welcome at the table, but do I have to sit next to you?
Yes.
And
Sure.
Bruce Epperly is writing a book and wrote a book called Talking Politics with Jesus, a process perspective on the Sermon on the Mount. We'll get into process and the sermon at some point, I'm sure, but it's very enlightening. Janice goes at it from the individual perspective of our predicament, and Bruce enlarges it and wants to encompass the entire world in this discussion. So we're going to put the two of these together today and see where we come out at the end. But to set the stage for this discussion, I don't have to tell you that it's a world that we're living in. It's a very dangerous world right now, perhaps more dangerous than maybe the Second World War, and certainly since the Civil War. The distance between people in animosity is growing every day. Lifelong friendships are disrupted and even ended. Churches split over differences in internal hostility. We tend to bunker down in our own tribes and reinforce our own positions against others if we don't actually make them our enemies. And most congregations are purple. That is, we've got people who vote red sitting side by side with people who vote blue, and we tolerate, for the most part, each other, but it's hard to reach out and extend to them the same care that we would to our own tribe. So that's the world we're living in right now. What is a Christian to do? That's the issue. We know what Jesus taught. How are we to behave when we can't put those things into action? Too many obstacles in our way. So if you sense this tension in yourself, you've come to the right place. To begin, I'd like Janice Springer to explain the title of her book for us, which exemplifies this predicament very well. Janice? Yeah, I know we're all welcome at the table, but do I have to sit next to that person?
When the first time I worked with this material was when I was asked to deal with a wider church, a big Eastern city that had many churches in the denomination that not only were different economically, different racially, they were different even in language. And this title just came to me because it seems so to capture. We're all in favor of welcoming everybody until that person shows up, the person we don't like. And so the title seemed to capture the dilemma that we have. I'd like to have you at the table, but not at my table. You go sit at somebody else's table and feel welcome. I have also liked the title because I get so many chuckles from it. And so many people say, when I saw that title, I knew I had to read that book. Oh, good.
Indeed. Well, Bruce, as I mentioned, you take a kind of a global position in your book as opposed to simply or just uniquely individual. Your title suggests that Maybe a Christian can talk about politics without being offensive. How do you put Jesus and politics together?
Well, I don't think you can separate them. I think that everything in the Gospels has a political context and content. As feminist scholars noted maybe 50 years ago when I was getting started in graduate school, the personal is the political and the political is the personal. And we can't avoid our context. Jesus' context in writing the Sermon on the Mount was as an oppressed person living in occupied territory who could be impressed into servitude, to be asked to walk the second mile, so to speak, or the first mile, anytime, and he had no redress. Politics is different than partisanship, though. All of us live in communities, and how we live in communities is the issue. Communities by nature are diverse, and that diversity is recognized in the Sermon on the Mount and throughout the Gospels, and throughout especially the epistles of Paul, who was trying to address the hardcore realities of living in community. These days, it's very difficult to talk about anything political without creating a controversy and without being seen as biased. I think we begin the process by recognizing that the community exists and what are our goals for being in community. Are our goals in community going to be division, incivility, separation, alienation? Are their goals going to be aiming towards some sort of centered, what I call centered pluralism? That is a pluralism that's operating out of a common center. As Janice says, that's not an easy matter, because we are people who talk about unity, but quite often go to our own particular silos. It's not a particular easy matter for me, and that's where the personal and the political come together, that I have to take care of my own household too. Yeah, go ahead, Janice.
I think that politics and faith go together so well because hospitality is a virtue in nearly every world faith. And politics is just about who is going to receive hospitality.
I couldn't agree with you more. That was indeed one of the key aspects of Jesus' ministry. Who's invited to the table, to who belongs there, and can we possibly have everyone at the table? That's the great challenge, because many of us, I think, are want to walk as soon as there's a point of disagreement. And we need to find ways in our families, in our citizenship, in our congregations to have strong opinions when it's important to do so, and yet remain in fellowship as much as possible.
Bruce, do you agree? It seems to me that some years ago we were able to do that. You could talk a little bit of politics or a little bit of religion with someone who differed with you, and then you went off and had a cup of coffee together and got along fine. You just accepted that there were differences. And now we don't seem able to do that. Do you have any sense why that is?
I think a lot of it has to do with technology and the media, to be honest. I think that America has, I'm just speaking as an American, since I work a lot in theological issues related to being a citizen here in our country. There was a time when we felt we had a common cause. We had some serious problems in those days, obviously, with racism and Jim Crow and women's rights and other things. But there was a sense that people could be called, and all of us are within a few years of one another, I suspect. People referred to people as the loyal opposition.
Yes.
That was what I grew up, in the Eisenhower years as a child, and the loyal opposition was termed, the key word was loyal.
Yes.
The key word was that people had some common grounding. And I will be honest with you, Janice and Steve, they had a common grounding in facts. It's almost impossible to have rational, reconciling discussions if you don't have some common factual grounding that you can disagree on.
Yes.
You can disagree not on the facts, but on what their interpretation. We can say that the weather patterns going on right now in the United States indicate there are some climatology issues. That's different than calling climate change a hoax. Once that's said, there's no conversation.
Right. Yes.
But that it's 100 degrees in certain parts of the country where it's only 85 typically is a fact. And how we respond to that, saying, well, should we all have electric vehicles, or can we find other ways of responding to climate change? That's where the conversation happens of people of goodwill.
That's the issue, certainly. How do we get to that point? And going back to Janice for a moment, reading your book, I was reminded of the expression, be the change you want to see.
Yes.
And you summarized this so beautifully in a phrase, a one word or a one phrase prayer that is featured in your book and pretty much propels the whole book, which is, oh God, bless them and change me. Isn't it the others who need change? After all, we're pretty much okay, aren't we?
Yes, of course. I write in the book, I didn't, that phrase in some magazine, which I credit in the book, I don't remember just where it was right now. And I think we all read that and say, oh, that was a typo. It's supposed to be the other way around. But of course, it's not the other way around. We'd like it to be.
And I think Janice is onto something, because we these days, and it's probably always been the case, are really only responsible speaking to other adults. We're not here talking about children and grandchildren, but other adults, for our own selves and our own spiritual journey and how that works out. Lord knows we should pray for blessings for those with whom we disagree. I mean, I'll be honest with you that I decided that a handful of years ago that I was far too invested in having visceral responses towards certain political leaders, far too invested in that.
Yes.
And while my political advocacy did not change, I felt that there was a need to pray for them. And you're right, Janice, you've really hit on something. I cannot change what somebody at a MAGA rally, I cannot change them. I can pray for them, not necessarily that they agree with me even. Larry Dawsey calls those sort of prayers prayer muggings. When I'm pretty, it's a sort of prayer. Well, I pray for Tom that he give up being a homosexual.
Yeah.
That's a prayer mugging. But I can pray that I see some goodness in them, what the Quakers would call the something of God in them, and pray that I'm changed and that perhaps they find the way that they need to overcome whatever struggles they have.
I have a chapter in my book on that very thing. Bruce praying for the opponent's well-being and not trying to convert them to your point of view. That's not the point of the prayer.
Yes.
And I think that chapter is one of the most powerful parts of your book. It actually struck me as, boy, do I need this. And actually the whole book.
Oh, I know you do, Steve.
The whole book reminded me of my predicament. You talk about our egos a lot, Janice.
Yes.
And how they get in the way of making progress in relationships. And you spell out precisely how we mess up ourselves through our ego needs. Could you talk about that just a little bit?
Well, working with peace and justice issues is also working with our deep inner self. It's working with the Christ that dwells within, trying to let that part of ourselves come out in the air instead of being hidden away, covered by the ego. It's not that the ego is bad. We need an ego to function in the world, but it shouldn't be in the driver's seat. The indwelling Christ should be in the driver's seat for those of us Christian or whatever figure in our faith we have as the one that represents the goodness and the compassion and the forgiveness and all those virtues that are so important to us.
I would say that the bulk of the book is focused on changing ourselves, which is another way of saying transforming our hearts and our minds and putting them in a position where that ego can be fed through love and grace, which is confronted often with the realities of the world that we abhor.
Yes.
And that leads me to a question for both of you. And I think I'll start with Bruce first on this one. When we run into something that is, at least to ourselves, so despicable, so abhorrent, how do we speak truth to power?
And that is one of the most difficult things because, again, we have to, as Janice says, try our best to get our ego out of the way and try our best to operate from the higher self or the Christ self and elicit that. I take a walk about 5 in the morning, every morning in the little suburban trails in my neighborhood in Potomac, Maryland, and I run into on 2 or 3 mornings a week a woman who's with her mother, with her daughter, who's an older woman she's probably my age, who's a Hindu. And, I oftentimes say namaste to her, and likewise she does to me, as the spirit or the divine in me greeting the divine in her.
Yes.
I think at times we have to call it what it is, obviously, and know that our calling it what it is just keeping our integrity and being impeccable in our own sense of what's right and wrong. And we can say I can say without a shadow of a doubt that the attacks on the Capitol and the prevarications that led to them share in some form of evil. I can say that. I can also say that the persons who were involved are more complicated than cardboard characters.
Yes.
That they're dealing with their ego needs. They're dealing with their need for healing. I heard a good friend of mine, he was my father's pastor at Grace Baptist Church in San Jose, Michael Ray Matthews. He was speaking up at Chautauqua Institution where we were last week, and he made the comment that white nationalism hurts the souls of white people. And when we think that the injustices that we perceive in others may also, when they're intentional, be hurting them, it gives us a degree of compassion. Howard Thurman, who is one of my teachers, made the comment that all mystics become social activists because they want everyone to experience the same freedom they've had. And they also realize that those that they see as oppressors need to be liberated too. And so they see that their freedom and the freedom of those whom they encounter are bound together. I'll just say one quick word. I have trouble personally, and I have to keep hope on this issue, to believe that anything can change at this point in time. I have trouble, and I can't let that. I have to remember what Janice says, that it really. I'm at the end of the day, even though I think that there are tremendous evils in the world being done related to the climate, being done related to racism and sexism, homophobia, and democracy in our country. The 25% for whom all the things that I think are important, who will say those are hoaxes, may never change. And I still have to go about the business of caring for them and not demonizing them. An example, I was an administrator and professor at Lancaster Theological Seminary in Pennsylvania for many years. And James Carville once described Pennsylvania as being Philadelphia and Pittsburgh and Alabama. And having said that, if your car broke down, it would be some of the most salt of the earth people were the people with the shotguns in their pickups and their Trump stickers. If your car broke down, they'd stop and help you out. And you'd have to say that there is, in quotes, some good in those I see as evil, and some evil in those myself who I think are good, and realize that there is maybe a ground that we can meet.
Excellent, Bruce.
Steve,
go ahead, Janice.
You pointed out that Bruce and I are aiming at the same thing, but he's trying to change. He goes about it by trying to change the world, and I go about it by trying to change the individual. And they're both necessary and they're both important. Yes. Bruce, you said in your book somewhere, when we focus only on external change without concern for the inner life, everything falls apart. We become the oppressor that we're trying to attack. We become that same person.
Well, and it sure is the case. I mean, I think virtually every political revolution has ended up replacing the old guy with the new guy who may have a different perspective in terms of how things should be solved, but ends up being just as draconian in their leadership and in their stifling of free speech and human freedom, because they haven't done the inner work. And I think that the Sermon on the Mount is a perfect blend of that, because Jesus is talking about inner work and outer action, and inner work and how to live in a society where where you aren't perceived as being of much value, how to live. He was speaking to people, the majority of whom were oppressed, the majority of whom had no political power, majority of whom were peasants, and yet he believed that they too could be transformed, not just to live acquiescing to the evils. What does Harry Emerson Fosdick say? Save us from weak desperation to the evils we abhor, but that in their changing themselves, it might elicit a change in the broader world. And at least the early Christian movement did make tremendous changes in the Western world, starting from the inside.
Yes.
Janice, let me throw kind of a nuance to that question to you.
Okay.
What makes us entitled to speak truth to power, given that our ego is often operating on that level?
Goodness, you ask hard questions. The word entitled kind of throws me. I would say we're called to speak truth to power, with the understanding that we're not where we want to be our own selves. We can imagine goodness more fully than we can attain it. But I think we're entitled because we're called as people of faith to do the inner work and the outer work both.
Well, I think that is a good place to end this conversation, to do the work that makes our inner and our outer worlds come together in such a way that we can address one another as thous, as ourselves, and relate to them as Jesus would relate to them. Study the Sermon on the Mount, everybody. Get back to it. One of the things that I appreciated most about that sermon, and Bruce deals with this in the book, is how to be perfect as God is perfect. And the answer is God sends the rain and the sunshine on the just and the unjust. Who are we to not do likewise?
Yes.
Both books take us in that direction. I hope that we've enticed you enough to take a look at them, because they are life-changing. My life, I mean, I'm almost 79 years old right now. I needed this book, and I needed Bruce's book, so that I could get both of the worlds together, the macro and the micro worlds we live in, so that I can become a better advocate for the gospel. That's what these books will do for you. So thank you for joining us. Thank you, Janice and Bruce. It's been delightful. We look forward to getting together another time, because I know there's a lot more that you have for us, and we look forward to that. So
thank you,
everybody, take care, God bless, and remember, bless them and change us.